The nurse handed me a sealed white envelope, and I remember thinking it looked too plain for something that would end my engagement 3 days later. My name is Maren Whitfield. I was 31 years old, 7 months pregnant, and sitting alone in a hospital hallway because my fiancé, Colton, had been called away for an emergency at work. An emergency that, as it turned out, had a name, and that name was my sister, Ivy. I didn't know that yet. I only knew the envelope in my hands contained the results of a paternity test I never asked for, ordered under my name, at a clinic I had never visited, using a signature that was not mine. Let me back up. 3 years earlier, Ivy and I had barely spoken. She was the golden daughter, the one my mother introduced at parties, the one who got the corner office at 26, the one who never let a room forget she was in it. I was the quiet one, the one who stayed home on Thanksgiving to help clean up, while everyone else took photos in the good light. I loved her in the complicated way you love a sister who has spent her whole life making sure you know she got there first. But I never once thought she'd do what she did. When I met Colton, everything changed, not because he fixed anything broken in me, but because for the first time, someone chose me first. He was steady in a way I didn't know men could be. He remembered how I took my coffee. He drove 4 hours to sit with me in an ER waiting room when my father had a minor stroke, and he didn't complain once, and he held my hand the entire time like letting go wasn't an option. Consider, Ivy met him twice before the engagement. Both times she was polished, warm, funny, the version of herself she saved for people worth impressing. I remember feeling proud, actually, proud that my sister approved. I didn't know yet that approve and want for herself could live in the same sentence quietly for years without me ever noticing the difference. The pregnancy was not planned, but it was wanted desperately, achingly wanted, in the way you want something you've been afraid to ask for out loud. Colton cried when I told him, not performative tears, real ones, the kind that catch a grown man off guard. He proposed 4 weeks later with his grandmother's ring in the kitchen of our apartment, both of us still in pajamas, because he said he didn't want to wait for a moment. He wanted the moment to be us, ordinary and real. I thought that was the safest I would ever feel. Then, 6 weeks before my due date, Colton started pulling away. Small things at first, phone face, down on the counter, later nights at the office. A new password on a laptop that used to sit open between us like nothing needed hiding. I told myself it was nerves. New fathers get nervous. I'd read that somewhere in one of the dozen pregnancy books stacked on my nightstand, and I clung to that sentence like it was scripture. I didn't know my sister had been sending him messages for 3 months. I didn't know those messages had shifted, slowly, cleverly, from casual check-ins about wedding planning to quiet seed, planting doubts. Are you sure the timeline adds up? I'm not saying anything. I just love you both, and I don't want you blindsided. I didn't know she'd found an old photo, one from a work conference I'd attended alone, back before Colton and I were exclusive, and used it to build a story that had just enough truth in it to survive a cross-examination. I didn't know, because my sister was very, very good at making sure I never knew anything until it was already too late to stop it. What I knew, sitting in that hallway with the envelope trembling in my hands, was that Colton had called me an hour earlier and asked, in a voice I'd never heard him use with me before, flat, careful, like he was reading from a script he hated, whether I would be willing to take a paternity test. For peace of mind, he'd said, just so there's no doubt. I need there to be no doubt, Maren. I remember the sound that came out of me wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a laugh. It was something in between, something ugly and disbelieving, because the baby moving inside me at that exact moment was the most certain thing I had ever known in my life, and the man I loved was asking me to prove it with paperwork. I didn't fight him on it. I look back now and wonder why, maybe because some small, self-protective part of me needed to know exactly how deep the lie went before I decided how to burn it down. So I went to the clinic, I gave my sample, and I waited alone in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights for a piece of paper to tell my fiancé, say what I already knew in my bones. What I didn't expect was to open that envelope and find a second sheet folded behind the first, one I hadn't requested, one addressed not to me, but to Colton, dated 2 weeks earlier, with Ivy's name printed neatly at the bottom of the intake form. She'd already run this test on someone else's sample, and the results were sitting right there in my lap 3 days before my own wedding, in ink that wasn't going anywhere. I sat in that plastic chair for 11 minutes before I let myself read the second sheet properly. I counted them, actually 11 minutes, watching the second hand on the clinic's wall clock stutter around its face, because reading it meant the next part of my life had already started without my permission, and some childish part of me thought, if I just didn't look, I could stay in the version of my life where Colton still trusted me. The form was a standard paternity intake sheet, same as mine, same clinic letterhead, same boxes for name, date of birth, relationship to the alleged father. Under sample provided by, it said Ivy Whitfield, under purpose of test. In her handwriting, round, confident, the same handwriting that used to sign birthday cards love, your favorite sister as a joke that was never fully a joke, it said, concerned family member, requesting confirmation prior to informing affected party. I read that sentence 4 times before it made sense. She hadn't given her own sample to prove anything about herself. She'd submitted something else, a hair, a swab, something taken without my knowledge, and labeled it as coming from me. My hands went cold before my mind caught up to why. I called the clinic's front desk from the hallway, my voice doing that thing where it comes out steadier than you feel, and asked to speak to whoever had processed intake for a Whitfield file weeks prior. The woman who answered was kind, apologetic in the practiced way of someone who fields upset calls daily, and she told me she couldn't discuss another patient's file due to privacy law, but she could confirm, since my name was on today's paperwork as the sample donor for a related case number, that yes, the 2 files had been linked administratively because they referenced the same alleged father, Colton. Ivy had gone in 2 weeks before I ever set foot in that building and submitted something under the pretense of being a concerned family member, requesting a paternity comparison between Colton and a sample she claimed came from me, except it hadn't. It couldn't have. I had never once doubted this baby was Colton's, because there was no universe, no timeline, no scenario in which it could be anyone else's. Which meant either the lab had made an impossible error, or my sister had provided a sample that was never mine at all, banking on the fact that grief, fear, and enough manufactured doubt would make Colton believe whatever number came back. I drove home that night without remembering a single mile of the road. I let myself into the apartment and found Colton at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd proposed, staring at his phone like it had personally betrayed him. She sent me photos, he said, before I'd even set my keys down. His voice cracked on photos, and for one disorienting second I felt sorry for him, because whatever was on that screen, he clearly believed it. From the conference, you and some guy, Maren, close, really close, and a caption that said, "Let me see it," I said. He turned the phone around, and there I was, 7 months before I ever downloaded a dating app. 7 months before Colton and I had exchanged more than a polite nod at a mutual friend's barbecue. Standing next to my old coworker Dev at an industry mixer, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder in the kind of photo strangers take of you at open bars because someone's phone battery is at 4% and everyone's laughing at a joke you can't remember. Underneath it, in a text bubble from a contact saved as Ivy's sister, was a caption I hadn't written and would never have written. This was around the time she says she got pregnant. Just thought you deserved to know before the wedding, not after. Colton, I said, and I heard how quiet my own voice had gone. That photo is from a work event, before we even met. Look at the metadata, look at the date stamp, I can prove. I know the date. He said, and something in his face had already started to fracture, doubt sitting right alongside guilt for even entertaining it. That's what scared me. It's close enough that I couldn't stop thinking about it. And then the test, Maren, if the results come back and there's even a chance. There is no chance, I said. There has never been a chance, and I think you already know that, somewhere underneath whatever my sister has spent months building in your head. He didn't answer. He just looked at me the way you look at someone when you're standing at the edge of believing them, and something keeps pulling you back. I took the envelope out of my bag and set the second form on the table between us. Ivy's name, Ivy's handwriting, the case number linking it to my own file. I think you should ask her, I said, whose sample she actually gave them, because it wasn't mine. Colton picked up the paper. I watched his eyes move across it once, twice, and then I watched something in his expression I hadn't seen before. Not doubt about me anymore, but the first real crack of doubt about her. She told me she loved us both too much to stay quiet. He said slowly, like he was hearing the sentence for the first time, even though he'd clearly repeated it to himself for weeks. She said she'd never lie to me. She didn't lie to you, I said. She just never told you the whole truth. There's a difference, and I think it's time you found out exactly how big that difference is. Neither of us moved to call her that night. But 3 days later, at what should have been my wedding rehearsal, Ivy walked into the room already smiling, and had no idea the second form was sitting in my purse, waiting for her. The rehearsal dinner was supposed to be at a small vineyard 40 minutes outside the city, the kind of place with string lights and a view that made every photo look like it belonged in a magazine. I had picked it 8 months earlier, back when picking a venue was the biggest decision I thought I'd have to make that year. I remember standing in that same spot during the walkthrough, laughing with the coordinator about seating charts, feeling like my life had finally arranged itself into something solid. Now I stood at the edge of the same lawn with a folded paper in my purse and a baby pressing insistently against my ribs, watching my sister walk toward the group with a bottle of champagne in each hand like she was hosting her own celebration. Ivy had always known how to enter a room. She wore a pale green dress that caught the last of the evening light, and she laughed at something my mother said before she'd even fully crossed the lawn, and for one disorienting second I watched. 30 years of memory tried to convince me this was just my sister, being my sister, nothing more sinister than a woman who liked attention. Then I looked at Colton. He wasn't laughing. He stood near the head table with his jaw set in a way I recognized from the night before. The same look he'd had reading that second form, except now it had hardened into something with a direction. He caught my eye across the lawn, and I gave him the smallest nod, the one we'd agreed on the night before over a conversation that lasted until 2 in the morning, the one that meant tonight, not tomorrow. We do this tonight. Neither of us had wanted to wait until after the wedding to have this conversation, with a lie sitting underneath it like a fault line. Dinner started the way rehearsal dinners always start. Too much wine poured too early, my father tapping his glass for a toast he'd clearly practiced in the car, Colton's mother crying a little at nothing in particular, because that's what mothers of grooms do. I smiled through all of it. I laughed at my father's joke about how long it took Colton to propose. I let Ivy refill my water glass and thank the caterer and generally behave like a woman who had done nothing wrong. And I understood, with a clarity that surprised me, that I wasn't angry in the way I expected to be angry. I was calm, cold, precise, waiting. It was Colton who brought it up, not me. He waited until the plates had been cleared and the toasts had wound down and people had started that comfortable post. Dinner drift into smaller conversations, and then he stood, tapped his own glass not for a toast, I realized after a beat too long, but simply to get the table's attention, and said, in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry, before we get much further into tonight. I want to clear something up. Ivy, can I ask you something in front of everyone? The table went quiet in that particular way. Tables go quiet when they sense a toast has become something else entirely. My mother's smile faltered. My father set down his glass. Ivy laughed, the sound a half. Beat too bright. Of course, what's up? 2 weeks ago. Colton said, you sent me a paternity test result. You told me it came from Maren's sample, that you'd arranged it quietly because you were worried, because you loved us both too much to stay silent. Do you remember that? I watched the color leave my sister's face in stages, first her cheeks, then something behind her eyes that I had genuinely never seen falter in 31 years of watching her win every room she walked into. Colton, this isn't really the place. I have the intake form, he said, and his voice didn't rise, which somehow made it worse, more final than if he'd shouted. It has your name on it as the sample donor, not Maren's, yours, which means either you submitted your own DNA and lied about whose it was, or you submitted something else entirely and told me it belonged to the woman I'm marrying tomorrow. The silence that followed had weight to it, a physical pressure that made the string lights overhead seem too bright, the wine glasses too loud when someone shifted and one clinked against a plate. I did it to protect you, Ivy said finally, and her voice had lost all its polish, all its practiced warmth, gone thin and fast the way voices go when a story is collapsing in real time. I saw that photo and I panicked, and I wanted to be sure, for your sake, before you married into something you'd regret. Whose sample was it? I asked. It was the first thing I'd said all night that wasn't performance, and every head at the table turned toward me. You didn't take mine. I never gave you anything. So whose blood did you send them, Ivy? She didn't answer right away. My mother had gone very still beside her, and I watched something shift in my mother's expression too, not confusion, but the particular stillness of someone doing math she didn't want to finish. It doesn't matter, Ivy said too quickly. The point is I was trying to protect this family, and instead of thanking me, you're both acting like I'm the villain whose sample. Colton repeated, and this time his voice did rise just slightly, just enough. Ivy whose? She looked at him, then at me, then, for the briefest second, so brief I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, at my mother. Mine, she finally said. It was mine. I told them it was Maren's because I knew if I used my own name they'd never process the comparison, and I needed you to see the result, Colton. I needed you to understand. Understand what? I said. My voice had gone very quiet. Ivy's hands were shaking now, the champagne bottle she still held trembling enough that a thin line of liquid crept over the lip and down her wrist, and she looked at Colton with an expression I had never once seen her wear in my direction, not triumph, not even guilt, but something closer to grief. That it should have been me, she said, that you were never supposed to end up with her. The table went absolutely silent, and somewhere behind me, I heard my mother's chair scrape back as she rose halfway out of her seat, and I understood, in that single suspended second, that the story I thought I'd walked into tonight was not the story I was actually standing inside of at all. The sentence hung over the table long enough that I watched 3 separate expressions cross Colton's face. A confusion, then disbelief, then something that looked almost like nausea, the specific kind that comes from realizing you've been standing closer to a cliff edge than you understood. What are you talking about? He said slowly, and I noticed he'd taken a half, stepped back from her without seeming to realize he'd done it. Ivy's composure had fully broken now, the polished version of her that had walked across that lawn an hour earlier completely gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized, someone raw, someone who looked for the first time in my adult memory younger than me instead of 3 years older. We had coffee, she said. Back in February, before you two were even official. You called me, you wanted advice about a ring, and we talked for 2 hours, and I really thought there was something there, Colton. Something you felt too, and then a month later, Maren tells me she's pregnant and getting married, and it was like watching someone take the one thing I actually wanted. I called you for advice because you're her sister, Colton said, and his voice had dropped into something quiet and stunned. That's it. That's all that ever was. That's not all it was for me, Ivy said, and her voice cracked on the last word. I should have felt something enormous in that moment, betrayal, rage, vindication, some combination violent enough to match the size of what she'd just admitted. Instead, I felt strangely still, the way you feel in the eye of something rather than the storm itself, because I was watching my mother's face, and my mother's face was doing something I had never seen it do before. She wasn't shocked. She was ashamed. Mom, I said, and the word came out sharper than I meant it to. You look like you already knew that. My mother sat back down slowly, both hands flat on the table, like she needed them there to stay steady, and for a long moment she didn't say anything at all. The rest of the table, Colton's parents, my father, a scattering of cousins and old family friends who'd shown up expecting toasts and wine and had instead gotten the unraveling of 31 years of family architecture, sat frozen in that particular silence people hold when they sense they've become witnesses to something they were never meant to see. I knew she had feelings for him. My mother finally said, I didn't know about the test. I swear to you, Maren, I didn't know about that. But you knew about the feelings, I said. And you let her come to my engagement dinner. You let her plan the bridal shower. You let her stand up there tonight and pour champagne like none of this was happening underneath everything. I thought it would pass, my mother said, and there was something in her voice now that sounded almost pleading, the voice of a woman trying to justify a choice she'd known was wrong even while she was making it. I thought if I said something, if I made it a whole conversation, I'd be the one blowing up the family over a crush that would fade on its own. I didn't think she'd actually. She stopped, glanced at Ivy, and something passed between them that looked like decades of old patterns snapping into place without either of them choosing it. I didn't think you'd do something like this. You've always thought that, Ivy said quietly, and there was real bitterness in it now, old bitterness, the kind that doesn't form overnight. You've always given me the benefit of the doubt right up until it's too late to matter. It's how I got away with everything my whole life, Mom. You just decided not to look. I felt something shift in my chest at that, not sympathy exactly, but a strange, unwilling flicker of understanding, the recognition that whatever had brought my sister to this table tonight with a fabricated lab report and a stranger's captioned photo hadn't started 3 months ago. It had started years ago, in 100 small moments where someone should have said something and didn't, where the golden daughter was allowed to want things that weren't hers without anyone ever asking her to stop. That flicker of understanding lasted exactly as long as it took me to remember that she had submitted a paternity test using deceptive information, sent my fiancé a photo with a fabricated timeline 3 days before our wedding, and stood in front of my entire family, smiling with 2 bottles of champagne, while she let a lie sit in his phone like a bomb with a slow fuse. I need you to leave, I said, and I was surprised by how calm my voice sounded, how little it shook considering how hard my hands were shaking at my sides. Not just tonight. I need you to leave, and I need you to understand that whatever this was, whatever you've been carrying for however long, it doesn't entitle you to blow up my wedding to test whether it was real. Maren, I'm not finished, I said, and something in my tone made her stop. You didn't just lie to Colton. You put my baby in the middle of it. You made him question whether this child is even his 3 days before we get married because you couldn't sit with the fact that he chose me. That's not a crush, Ivy. That's cruelty. And I don't know yet if I can forgive that. But I know I can't stand here and pretend it's something smaller than it is. She looked at me for a long moment, and I watched something in her face try to argue and then finally give up. I'll go, she said quietly. She set the champagne bottles down on the table, gently, almost carefully, as if some old habit of politeness was the only thing still functioning underneath the wreckage of everything else, and she turned and walked back across the lawn the way she'd come, except this time no one watched her the way they had an hour earlier. This time every eye at that table followed her out of something closer to disbelief than admiration. Colton sat back down beside me, and under the table, without a word, he found my hand and held it the way he had in that ER waiting room years earlier, like letting go wasn't an option he was willing to consider, no matter what the night had just cost either of us. But as the rest of the table slowly exhaled into the kind of quiet, murmured aftermath that follows every family explosion, my phone buzzed once in my purse. A text from a number I didn't recognize, sent at 8:47 p.m., right around the moment Ivy had been walking away from us across that lawn. It read, "You should ask her why she really needed a paternity test this badly." It was never about you and Colton. I stared at the message until the words stopped making sense as words and became just shapes on a screen. You should ask her why she really needed a paternity test this badly. It was never about you and Colton. Colton read it over my shoulder, and I felt his hand tighten around mine. Who is that? I don't know, I said, and I didn't. The number had no name attached, no photo, nothing but 10 digits and a message that had arrived at the exact moment my sister was walking away from the wreckage she'd made. I typed back with shaking thumbs, "Who is this?" The reply came almost instantly, like whoever it was had been waiting, phone in hand, watching the same lawn from somewhere I couldn't see. "My name is Renee. I work at Coastal Fertility and Genetics, the clinic Ivy used. I shouldn't be telling you any of this, and I could lose my job for it. But I've been sitting with this for 2 weeks, and I can't anymore. Can you call me?" I looked up and found Colton's mother quietly herding the remaining guests toward their cars, murmuring something about a long day and everyone needing rest, and I understood distantly that she was giving us cover, buying us privacy without being asked. My father sat with his head in his hands. My mother hadn't moved from her chair. "I need to call this number," I told Colton, and he nodded and steered me toward the empty end of the vineyard's gravel lot, away from the last stragglers, and stood close enough that I could feel him there without crowding. Phone against my ear. Renee answered on the first ring. Her voice was younger than I expected, nervous, the voice of someone doing something she'd clearly debated doing for a long time before finally deciding the risk was worth it. "I process intake for genetic testing," she said, after I confirmed who I was. "2 weeks ago, your sister came in requesting 2 separate tests. One was the paternity comparison, the one involving your fiancé, which she filed under your name, but she also requested something else that day, a carrier screening for herself." A carrier screening for what? Renee hesitated long enough that I heard the hallway noise behind her shift, a door closing somewhere, like she'd stepped somewhere more private before continuing. "For a genetic condition that runs in families," she said. I'm not supposed to say more than that without her consent, and I want to be careful here, because this isn't really my story to tell, but I'll say this, the reason she was so insistent on paternity results, so fixated on getting them fast, wasn't really about proving anything about you and Colton. It was because the carrier screening came back positive, and she panicked, and she needed to understand what that meant for your family before she figured out how to tell anyone. I felt the ground under the conversation shift again, the anger I'd been holding onto all night suddenly competing with something colder and more complicated, fear, maybe, or the specific dread of realizing a story you thought you understood completely has another layer underneath it you never accounted for. "What condition?" I said. "I really can't say more than I already have," Renee said, and I could hear real conflict in her voice, the sound of someone who had crossed one line for reasons she believed in and wasn't willing to cross the next one. "But I'd strongly encourage you to talk to your doctor. If there's a hereditary condition in your family and your sister just found out she's a carrier, that's not just her information anymore. That could matter for your baby too." The words landed somewhere far past anger, somewhere that made my hand find my stomach without me deciding to move it there. "Why would she use my name on a completely different test?" I asked, "the paternity one. If this was really about her own results, why drag Colton into it at all?" Renee was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, I think finding out something frightening about herself and finding a reason to blow up your engagement happened around the same time, and grief does strange things to people's timing. I don't think it excuses what she did with that photo or the fake sample label. I just think it's more complicated than jealousy alone, and I didn't want you walking away from tonight thinking it was only ever about spite." I thanked her, my voice thinner than I wanted it to be, and hung up and stood there in the gravel lot with Colton's hand steady on my back while headlights swept slowly out of the vineyards. Driveway behind us, guest by guest, the rehearsal dinner dissolving into the kind of night none of us would ever describe accurately to anyone who hadn't been there. "What condition runs in our family?" Colton asked quietly, and I realized I didn't fully know the answer myself, not with certainty, not with the kind of clarity that came from anyone ever sitting the two of us sisters down and explaining it properly. There were whispers, old and half-formed, about a great aunt who died young, about a cousin on my mother's side who'd never been discussed in detail past a certain point in every family gathering. The kind of history that exists in a family the way water exists in a sponge, present everywhere, visible nowhere, until someone finally wrings it out. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think it's time somebody in this family finally told me." I turned back toward the vineyard, where my mother still sat alone at the long table under the string lights, exactly where we'd left her, staring at nothing, and I understood, walking toward her across that lawn with my hand pressed instinctively against the curve of my stomach, that the envelope I'd opened 3 days earlier had never really been about Colton at all. It had been the first thread of something my family had been quietly, carefully unraveling for far longer than I'd known to look. My mother didn't look up when I sat down across from her. The string lights above the table had started to attract moths, small pale shapes circling the bulbs in slow, aimless loops, and for a moment neither of us said anything, the silence filling with the sound of gravel shifting under the last few cars pulling away. "Tell me," I said, "everything, right now, before I go one more day not knowing something that apparently affects my own child." My mother finally looked at me, and I saw something in her face I recognized from years of small, careful omissions, not cruelty exactly, but a kind of practiced avoidance, the specific exhaustion of a woman who had spent decades deciding, moment by moment, what was safe to say out loud. "My mother, your grandmother, lost a sister when she was young," she said. 19 years old, it was never talked about as an illness growing up. It was talked about as she was always sickly, like it was a personality trait instead of a diagnosis. It took me until I was in my 30s to understand what had actually happened, and by then I'd already decided it was easier not to bring it up. "Bring what up?" I said. "Mom, I need an actual name, not a story about how nobody in this family likes talking about things." She exhaled slowly. "It's a hereditary blood disorder, rare but not unheard of, and it can be passed down even when a parent only carries the gene without ever showing symptoms themselves. I found out I was a carrier When I was pregnant with Ivy, the doctor told me there was a chance either of you could inherit it or carry it yourselves, and I made a choice back then that I've regretted more times than I can count. I decided not to tell either of you, because the tests back then were expensive and imperfect, and I convinced myself that if it never came up, it would simply never matter. It matters now. I said, I'm 7 months pregnant, and apparently my sister just found out she's a carrier, and nobody thought that was relevant information for me to have. I didn't know Ivy had gotten tested until tonight. My mother said quietly, I promise you that. If I'd known she'd found out, I would have told you myself, whatever it cost me. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the baby shift under my ribs, feeling Colton's presence behind me, even though he'd stayed a respectful few steps back to give my mother and me room. I thought about every Thanksgiving where Ivy had seemed just slightly too bright, too determined to be the version of herself everyone expected. I thought about the coffee she'd had with Colton in February, the ring advice, the crush she'd apparently carried quietly enough that even I hadn't noticed, layered now against a diagnosis she must have been sitting with completely alone for 2 weeks before she ever showed up at my rehearsal dinner with 2 bottles of champagne and a lie in her back pocket. It didn't excuse what she'd done. I kept circling back to that, needing to hold both truths at once without letting one dissolve the other, that my sister had done something genuinely unforgivable to my relationship days before my wedding, and that she had also been quietly terrified, alone, carrying news about her own body that nobody had bothered preparing her to receive. I need to get tested, I said finally. Me and the baby as soon as possible, not because I doubt anything about who my daughter's father is, because apparently there's a decades-old secret sitting in our blood that somebody should have mentioned before now. My mother nodded, and for the first time all night, she looked less like a woman defending herself and more like a woman finally putting down something heavy she'd been carrying long enough to forget how much it weighed. The genetic counselor we saw 4 days later after a wedding that happened quietly on schedule, with exactly the people who deserved to be there and none of the people who didn't, confirmed that I was not a carrier. Our daughter, born 6 weeks later at a healthy 7 pounds 2 ounces, was in the clear. Colton cried again when the counselor told us, the same unguarded tears he'd cried the first time I told him I was pregnant, and I remember thinking that if there was one thing this entire ordeal had proven beyond any envelope or lab report, it was that his tears had never once been performance. He simply felt things all the way through without flinching, and I understood, watching him hold our daughter for the first time 3 weeks after that, exactly why I'd chosen him in the first place. Ivy and I didn't speak again for 4 months. When we finally did, it wasn't at a family dinner or a forced reconciliation orchestrated by our mother. It was a single message sent late on a Tuesday night that simply said, I'm getting help. Not because I expect you to forgive me. I just thought you should know I'm not the same person who did what I did that night. I didn't respond right away. I'm still not entirely sure what an honest response looks like, 3 years into a wound that deep, though I've started to believe that forgiveness and trust aren't actually the same thing, and you can offer one without fully restoring the other. I've let her meet her niece exactly twice since then, both times supervised, both times shorter than she probably wanted, and I've told her, plainly, that rebuilding anything between us will take longer than either of us wants it to. What I know for certain is this: the envelope I opened in that hospital hallway didn't just nearly end my engagement. It cracked open a family history that had been quietly buried for 2 generations, forced a diagnosis into daylight that might have stayed hidden through another pregnancy, another sister, another decade of polite avoidance dressed up as privacy. My sister's lie was cruel and deliberate, and I don't think time will ever make me pretend otherwise. But underneath the cruelty was a truth my family had been avoiding since before I was born. And sometimes the ugliest way a secret finally surfaces is also, somehow, the only way it ever would have. My daughter will grow up knowing exactly where she comes from, the good parts and the complicated parts both, because I decided, the night I sat across from my mother under those string lights, that our family had kept enough silence to last 100 more years, and I wasn't willing to hand any more of it down. I used to think the worst thing that could happen to a family was a scandal. Something loud, something that made people whisper behind their hands at the next holiday dinner. Now I know better. The worst thing that can happen to a family isn't a scandal at all. It's silence. It's the quiet decision made over and over across generations that some truths are safer left folded up in a drawer than spoken out loud at a dinner table where someone might actually hear them. My sister didn't destroy my wedding because she was evil. I want to be careful saying that because for a long time I needed her to be simply, uncomplicatedly wrong. And it was easier to hold on to anger than to hold on to anything more complicated. But the truth is messier than that, the way truth almost always is. She destroyed a rehearsal dinner because she was frightened and jealous and carrying a diagnosis she didn't know how to say out loud, and instead of asking for help, she reached for the only tool she'd ever really been taught to use, control the story before anyone else can tell it. I think about that envelope more than I probably should. The plain white one the nurse handed me in a hospital hallway, the one that looked too ordinary to hold the weight it turned out to carry. I've thought about keeping it, framing it even, some strange trophy of the night my life nearly came apart. Instead, I put it in a small box in the back of my closet, along with the ultrasound photos from that same week, because I wanted a reminder that both things were true at once, that something painful and something precious can exist in the same folder of your life, on the same shelf, without canceling each other out. If you're watching this and you're waiting for me to tell you I hate my sister, I won't give you that ending because it isn't true anymore, and I promised myself a long time ago I wouldn't perform an emotion I don't actually feel just because it makes for a cleaner story. What I feel is something quieter and harder to summarize, grief for the version of our relationship we lost, respect for the work I've watched her do to become someone steadier, and a boundary I'm still not ready to lower all the way, and may never be. To Colton, I'll say this because he's never once asked me to say it publicly, and he deserves to hear it anyway. Thank you for asking the hard question instead of quietly believing the easy lie. Thank you for standing at that rehearsal dinner and refusing to let doubt live in our house rent-free. A weaker man would have let the silence win. You didn't. And to anyone listening who's sitting on a secret right now, a diagnosis, a fear, a truth about your own family you've decided is safer left unsaid, I'd ask you to consider this. Secrets don't actually protect the people we love. They just delay the moment the truth arrives, and they almost always make that moment more painful than it needed to be. My family spent 2 generations avoiding 4 sentences of honest conversation, and it nearly cost me my marriage, and it very nearly meant my daughter grew up not knowing something important about her own body she knows now, she'll always know. That's the one thing I can promise her, the one inheritance I get to choose instead of the one I was handed, that in our house the truth gets to arrive on time. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If it moved you, if it reminded you of your own family, your own silences, your own envelopes waiting to be opened, I hope it made you brave enough to open one.